So from my left, Tameka, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, sure. Hi, everybody. I'm Tameka Vasquez. Very nice to see you all. So I do a few things currently full-time. I'm working for a company called Technologists. So they focus on natural language processing, which is a subset of artificial intelligence. And we're based out of London and New York. I'm their associate director of marketing. I do marketing and business development strategy. Outside of that, I'm an adjunct professor at St. John's University. I teach out of the Peter Tobin School of Business. And outside of that, I do a couple of advisement for various startups, some lecturing, some guest speaking, and things like that.
Fantastic, thank you. Jeff Bezos has said we need to be in every field of AI, and this includes defense. So, for the panelists, do you think this is it's ethical to be working for a company who is building AI that can have a DoD use or a offensive or defensive use? So let's go from this end and we'll go along.
It's tough, but I will say, if anything, the companies that have pulled out of initiatives like that, from what I've seen, it's been generated by their employees. So I think it's an interesting spin to ask, would you work for that type of company, or should you work for that type of company? I don't know, because I think the fact that there's so many unknown sort of factors that come along with any sort of government initiative, I think is very scary. But to the extent that you are aware of the application, and to the extent that you are aware of all of the connected bodies to whatever that application would be, I would say would be the first step as an employee, as a prospective employee of any company that has the power to force any sort of change for something as lethal as war.
Tameka, you mentioned marketing. You mentioned that ethics might be a marketing, it's going to be in marketing. As we talk about AI generally, how is it the ethics part going to be shaped? I mean, this is, the CEO of Microsoft asked us to have this discussion. Microsoft are fantastic at selling things. Do you think they're going to be selling ethics next?
Well, that's the thing. There are a few different themes there, right? Because digital activism has become a thing. Right? So I think we're starting to see a world shape where people want to talk about more than just consumerism. They sort of want to talk about meaning. And so from the marketing perspective, it's always about telling that story. That's the core of anything. Before you sell a product or a service, you have to figure out what's the story that you want to tell. And so as we talk about, I guess, any ethical topic, it always begins with what's the actual decision you are trying to make. If you start there, you figure out what's the story I have to tell you, so you understand that there is a way to make this decision, maybe a better way to make this decision. So, I mean, that's really the marketing perspective. I think the one thing that, just hearing what everybody else said, the one thing that I do see a lot more value in these days is just kind of this knowledge value chain framework, where you start with data that's supposed to tell you something, but by the end of that process, where you turn that data into knowledge, you're ultimately supposed to derive some kind of value from that you can bring back to the data. And it's supposed to be this cyclical sort of process. And I think as marketers, as people who really are in charge of selling things, selling ideas, you have to be able to take that knowledge, apply it in a new light for different people, for different reasons, in different contexts, and make sense of it. So yeah, I mean, storytelling, looking at data, bringing out knowledge from it, all of these things, it doesn't matter what the conversation is, I think it's going to eventually lead us into more of an understanding around ethics beyond just consumerism.
So I'm going to put you on the spot.
Okay.
Do you think the ethical AI company is going to do better or worse financially over the next decade than the unethical AI company?
That's really, really hard to say. I mean,
I'm not going to call it the Facebook question,
yeah.
But
so that's the thing, because ultimately, how do we even begin to challenge any company on their ethics or lack thereof? It's only when they face these sort of public scandals, or when they, fall into these blunders, that they're forced to answer certain questions. So I would say I don't know whether the ethical or unethical company will win in the end, because it's subject to opinion. But I do think we are starting to pay a lot more attention, and I encourage people to pay a lot more attention to what's going on, what are the applications of this technology that very, very few people actually understand the full breadth of. So I think that in the end is what's going to make the difference, is the extent to which there's a transparent kind of dialogue happening between companies and the public.
What's the one thing you tell Congress or Washington right now, if you could, you've got a direct line to someone in power?
Wow. I have a lot to say, but I guess, if we're talking about a world of artificial intelligence, I'll say just understand artificial intelligence could very easily become artificial stupidity if we're not careful.
Do you think we're not there already?
We're getting there, but I think the problem, to your point, is because I just don't see enough involvement, to Hugh's point as well, on the public sector side of the equation, in understanding not only who's behind these technologies, but how they truly work. It's embarrassing to see the sort of questions that come out of the Senate as they question various leaders in technology. I mean, questions as far as how do you make money as a social media network is insane. That would, for that to come from a senator, I think is a bit embarrassing. So yeah, I mean, I would say we're getting there slowly, but we're still far away from that world of, total tech domination, so long as the government is aware of where they have to intervene.
Yeah. Do we think AI can actually be regulated at all? Is it something we can really put a pause on? Or is it, by its very nature, impossible to actually regulate? Tameka?
I think the one thing that I find really fascinating about artificial intelligence is really the paradox that it presents us every single time, which is you can have a very good outcome, right, if used properly, and you can have a very bad outcome. You constantly live in that paradox. And so if you're able to look at regulation as an opportunity to kind of dissect that paradox and just take care of the areas where it can really do some damage, then it becomes a little bit easier to start having that conversation. So I think of it in terms of sectors, right? If you look at education, if you look at financial services, you look at the consumer markets, you look at the criminal justice system, right? So if you look at it through the sector by sector kind of viewpoint and you see the paradox that presents, you see that there's a way, let's say with education, there's a way to accelerate the pipeline of a child going from kindergarten to landing, in the right college and then moving on to have a thriving career. Or you see the other pipeline, which is predicting where that child is going to end up before they even have a chance to define their own lives, right? Simply by using data the wrong way, simply by applying algorithms where they don't belong. So if you look at it from a sector by sector sort of scenario and you are sensitive to the paradox, I think there's always opportunity for regulation, because you would just go down to the root of the issue of where you see this can easily go badly and then put the preventative blocks in place so that mess doesn't have to be cleaned up later.
Tameka, you've talked quite a lot on discrimination, especially when it comes to the workplace and hiring. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think with artificial intelligence, it really brings out where the gaps are with our society, right? And I think I check a lot of boxes, so I like to use myself as an example a lot. But being a person of color, being a woman, being an immigrant, certainly the world was not constructed with the likes of me in mind. And I think being able to use something like artificial intelligence to fill those gaps is going to be really important. One of the simple use cases that I could probably point out is when you think about the opportunities of just identity redaction and just being able to take out, the sort of things that could create bias very early on in that sort of pipeline as a prospective employee. So if you can take out my name, right? If you can take out anything that suggests my gender, anything that suggests my religious affiliation, anything that's sort of front and center, right? That whether you're willing to admit it or not could create some reaction of bias. If you can take that out and then automatically produce the best resume, then you shape the conversation differently as far as, what the future of work is going to be per the best qualified person, right? Because no matter how many times companies say that they're invested in diversity and all of these things, it's very hard to see clear-cut initiatives that are really moving in that direction. So I do think artificial intelligence presents this sort of, it's an opportune time to leverage the technologies that exist for reasons like, boosting diversity and furthering the future of work in that regard.
Tameka, we've talked about this offline?
Yeah, we've talked about this quite a bit because I think my biggest issue when it comes to this topic of jobs is that we tend to look at the world in a very binary way, and we're doing a very big disservice when we do that. So if we look at the world through the lens of public sector or private sector, Republican or Democrat, right? We are separating too much. And we're not coming together on an issue that everybody cares about, which is in this case jobs. So I think we have learned this lesson many, many times before. As you suggested, we've had so many industrial waves over the course of history, particularly here in the United States, that we don't have an excuse anymore as to how we're having this conversation. Personal opinion, I just think that if we're living in a world where we're sort of depending on nostalgia to drive us forward, and wanting to make places greater or great again as per some other time in history, we're never going to have the conversations that we need to have as far as what's actually happening today, what's actually relevant, and what's going to drive us for tomorrow. And I think government is in a very interesting position to have this conversation of jobs through the lens of augmentation and not so much us versus machine and all of this stuff. And I wish we were doing that more, but I certainly do care a lot about this.